Hi guys, welcome to your industry study video tutorial for today. Now we're going to be looking at the third subheading in the industry study. It's called environmental and sociological considerations. Basically, this focuses on the impact of your industry, whether it be multimedia or the timber industry, the impact of those industries on the environment and society as a whole. The first dot point here is about alternative resources. It's a dot point that provides some dash points underneath, which can often help to answer a question related to this dot point. So as we move into the alternative resources screen here, to understand alternative resources, you kind of have to get your head around what a traditional resource is first. So a traditional resource is something that someone uses to produce something. An example of a traditional resource in power would be coal. So we've used coal generated power for a really long time. It's considered a traditional resource. An alternative resource is something that replaces those traditional resources but has a lower negative impact on the environment. So when we're looking at alternative resources, it's things that industry can choose which will lower their impact on the environment. So choosing resources which will minimize their impact. The three areas that the syllabus lists for you are power, material, and processes. So there are traditional resources we can choose for each of these that will have a higher impact on the environment, and then there are alternative resources we can choose. So in terms of power, alternative resources that are around at the moment include solar power, wind generated power, geothermal power. That's where they pump water down into the ground and it actually heats up, which creates steam. Or there's some other sort of crazy ones out there that harness the power of waves and things like that. All ways that we can generate electricity without burning fossil fuels. So they would be considered alternative resources. Materials focuses around choosing, so in the timber industry, choosing materials that have that lower impact on the environment. So a traditional resource could be like old growth forest, which once it's chopped down doesn't replenish itself. And an alternative resource would be man-made timbers, which are made from plantation timbers, which do regenerate. So that alternative, choosing that alternative resource means that the impact is lessened on the environment. And processes is around choosing processes which minimize the impact. And that pretty much comes down to what the company or what a person is trying to achieve, and considering when they're choosing their processes, what impact that will have on the environment. And if it's higher than what they would like, then they can choose alternative processes. Something which could be key in your major project folio would be hitting on some of these things. So when you've done your research assessment, you've evaluated your resources and you've justified your choice, one of the things you can use to evaluate and justify could be the environmental impact of those, and that can inform your evaluation and help you justify your decision. The next syllabus dot point we're looking at, there's a bunch from here. Recycling and reusing, waste management, minimization, pollution, sustainable development, and rehabilitation of commercial sites, all coming under the subheading of environmental considerations. Recycling and reusing basically is about taking something that is no longer being used and using it in another way. So there's a distinction between recycling and reusing. Recycling is where you change something's form, and reusing is where you use it in its current form. So an example would be a plastic bottle. If we're going to recycle that, we put it in the recycling bin, it goes to the recycling plant, they melt it down and they turn it into something completely different. Reusing would be taking that bottle and filling it back up again and reusing it for the same purpose. It would be good for you to come up with some examples in your industry of how things are recycled and how some things are reused. It's important to understand the difference. And the reason that we would do those two things is to minimize our impact on the environment. The next dot point here is waste management and minimization. So when we manufacture anything, whether it be an online manufacturing like producing a video or manufacturing a piece of furniture, somewhere along the line there is some type of waste generated. If we don't consider how we manage that waste, then our impact on the environment increases. There are a few ways that we can manage our waste and minimize it. There are these 3 points here. Waste minimization comes from careful planning. So if we can do careful planning around what materials we're ordering or what we're using in the production of our product, to make sure that we're not buying excess that is then going to waste, and also making sure that we're using it in a way that is minimizing the wastage. We can also recycle and reuse. So as we discussed in the last slides, if we can reuse something, we should. It's better than putting it in the bin. If we can't reuse it, but it's recyclable, we should recycle it so that is minimizing our impact, minimizing the amount of material that is going into landfill. And then if we can't recycle and reuse, then obviously we need to dispose of wastage. We need to make sure that we're disposing of that wastage in a ethical way and in accordance with legislation. So we need to dispose of things safely, and that could be chemicals. You can't just drop any chemical in the bin to go into landfill. There are certain things that we need to do to make sure that they're disposed of correctly. The chemical example, there is companies that come and collect chemicals and then dispose of them in an appropriate way. Companies need to make sure they're doing that. They have a legal obligation and an ethical obligation to make sure that they're minimizing that waste, reusing and recycling what they can, and disposing of it safely so as to minimize that impact.